Evening and welcome once again to the St. Mark Bible Institute program. I'm John Klein, and with me tonight, as usual, is Ken Garrison, pastor of Fellowship Church and founder of the St. Mark Bible Institute. Good evening, Ken.
Good evening, John.
Ken, tonight's question's a real strange one. You know, evangelical Christians view getting someone saved as their number one priority. And the question is, was that Jesus' number one view and priority?
John, certainly, we know that Jesus would rejoice with the angels with a sinner coming to the Lord. But I think there's no question that Jesus looked at what I would see as the deliverance of the whole world as of paramount significance, and he points to that. You know, the disciples came to Jesus just before he was crucified, asking about his coming or the end of the age, and he responded to that, and obviously that was their concern.
Right.
So, well, let's look at that, John, in Matthew 24. The disciples came and asked the question.
This is right before that last Passover supper. They're sitting on the Mount of Olives, and the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming, returning, and of the end of the age?"
Okay, and his response, a little bit later in Matthew 24:36, he gives a response.
"But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone." Okay. So evidently that was very important to them, and he says, you're not supposed to, nobody knows the time.
Not even Jesus.
Yeah.
Not even Jesus.
So that leads you to believe that all these guys picking out the time shouldn't even be doing that.
Okay, so he said don't do that, so that probably is sufficient right there. Okay, so we want to set forth the premise tonight that there is no specific time, or it's a very general thing at best, and that we're really looking at a situation that will develop in mankind, and that will truly be the signal of the end of the age leading up to the very final struggle, rather than a specific time. And we want to consider some of those seasons and some of the signs of those seasons, because we believe that we can do that.
Okay, so obviously they're broad signs of the seasons. Remember, we're not looking for a specific date, but we're looking at a world situation.
World situation.
The season is the key here, and there are broad signs of the seasons, and the most significant sign that the scriptures over and over, the most where the most prophecies are on the prophetic scale of subjects, the most prophecies are in the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. And we know that started in the late 1800s, and and all the way up to today. There are now between 5 and 6 million Jews in Israel. And that's just about the largest population of any Jewish community in the world, about equal or a little more than the United States. Another sign, Ken, says that Jesus said that Jerusalem would be trodden down to the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Okay. So we have this great growth in Israel and the taking of Jerusalem some 40 years ago.
Okay, so then we agree then that, as you indicated, perhaps the most significant sign of the season that we're talking about, this general end-time season that the disciples were asking about, what would be the ultimate ingathering of the Jewish people to the land. Now, a second sign, actually we're seeing the results of the sign primarily in ecological disasters, and that's gaining a lot of attention today. But one of the driving factors on that is the incredible population growth in the world, and the doubling time. Now, from a mathematical perspective, the growth of population is an exponential function, and so that doubling time of around 30 or 40 years, and we really get a sense of the impact of that if we look at the population curve, and this is a very general population curve, but the estimated population around 1900 was 1 billion people on the earth, and now we've gone through 3 or 4 doublings, and actually we're up to 6.5 billion at estimate about 2000. And so the doubling time is something like 30 to 40 years. And so if we just project up the way, it's 2007 now, so 2037, something like that, or 2040, if we go to that time, we would imagine the population would be of the order of 13 billion.
Wow.
Doubled again.
So what, can the earth sustain that?
All right, so that's the point. The Bible speaks of the signs of the seasons again, in terms of famine and all kinds of plagues and sicknesses and so on. We talk about epidemics today that filter through the whole human population. Bird flu, I haven't heard anything about that for a few months, but there was a real concern about an epidemic. Yeah. So these are the signs, but it's being driven by the population.
Okay. Another sign then, another factor in this thing is the emergence of a global government. Now, with modern weaponry, this becomes even more important. There are, these nuclear weapons and all these splinter groups getting them, Iran getting them, and Al-Qaeda eventually, maybe. Then there's going to be this need for this global government type thing. And, we saw this at the end of World War I, the League of Nations, the end of World War II, the UN. Something even more grander or bigger or more powerful is coming down the pike too, as because of the weaponry, Ken, to control all of that.
And again, I think a population is driving the thing, and the development technology.
And these are all linked together, aren't they?
They're coupled together. And so the emergent, we all know that the Bible speaks of an Antichrist government, a one world government. I think anybody that studied Bible prophecy would concur with the emergence of such a government. What would promote such a thing? Well, the advance of weaponry, as John cited, and the world wars that brought the League of Nations and the United Nations. We believe that perhaps something much bolder is going to emerge as a result of Arab Muslim terrorism. That is, we're obviously engaged in terrorism, a war against terrorism today. All of us can remember a few years ago seeing the attack on the towers in New York. So we believe that very likely there will be emergency of a government be almost forced because of the threat of terrorism itself.
All right, and then Daniel 12 speaks of in the end days knowledge will increase. So in our day, there's been tremendous technological advances in every field. In transportation, why I've been around the world, just every continent almost. And but you can get there in a day, Ken. You can get on an airplane and you fly for 12, 13 hours, you're in the Middle East, or you're in Israel.
Yeah, if you don't get stuck at Newark.
Now, he's had a bad experience recently, but and nonetheless, we've all spent some time in the airports. But transportation has advanced tremendously. Communications, we could pick up a cell phone, call anywhere in the world. We're on the internet. We could view. Through Skype, we could talk to anyone in the world. So there are things that we could do today. Data management. I used to work for Ross Perot in the early 70s. They had rooms full of computers. Now what you have on your desktop is more advanced.
Much more advanced.
Than all of that. So certainly this has happened in our generation.
Right. I was saying to John earlier as we talked about this program, that when I was a graduate student at Purdue, that was a good while ago, but nevertheless, the main scientific computer, which took up a whole building, had enormous storage capacity of 64K.
Right. My son was telling me to have these little, instead of these, 1 gig cards
yes.
you did. They have we saw them in the paper, Best Buy this week. They have 130 gig just in that thing, and you hook it right on your computer through. It's unbelievable.
It's incredible. Now, and again, just focusing on this advance in this in our days, actually, in this transportation. Again, earlier when we were talking about this, my grandfather, he never drove in his whole life. He always relied on others, but in his early, as a farmer in his earlier days in Kentucky, he took produce to market or what very much the same way that Abraham did. It hadn't advanced very much from the days of Abraham, and now today, as you indicate, we go down to Orlando International, get on a plane, and we're in Israel or any other part of the world overnight.
Right.
It's
you indicated that now you're from the backwoods of Kentucky, but even your family, your brother, everybody has a computer, everybody's on the internet. So civilization is even in every corner of the world.
Even Kentucky. Now,
but it's true.
It's absolutely true. The advances have been incredible, and we're saying that I believe that God initiated these things. And sometimes it's difficult to tell a chicken and egg type problem, but I believe this whole sequence was initiated with God deliberately bringing the Jewish people back into the land. And Jeremiah declared at the time of the dispersion that God himself would be, he that scattered will regather. And so I think the end time signs of the season that we're talking about were precipitated deliberately by God.
And then all these things happened in the reaction to it.
Yeah, and again, sometimes you look at the chicken and egg problem. Maybe God, seeing that these things were emerging, chose this time, therefore, to ingather the people. Maybe these things are a satanic response to the fact that God did. We don't know. There's one final sign that the Bible speaks about that we haven't seen. Now, all the things that we've talked about so far, we have seen. And that is astronomical signs in the heavens. The Bible seems to point to maybe a disruption of the solar system and perhaps something like a collision of a giant asteroid with the Earth or the Moon or some of the planets, whatever. And so I don't think we've seen anything comparable to what the Bible seems to be pointing to. So that's still a sign of the season that we haven't seen.
So things are going to be winding down and getting a little desperate here. And then we see some
okay. Now let me just hold that point for a second, John. I think most of the stuff that we're pointing to, the human response here, is out of desperation. I think that's the reason for it.
Okay.
Who would want to choose a global sovereignty or global government, except that the demand for it would be so great that...
So it seems logical, not evil. It
right.
just seems, we have to evolve to manage things.
Mandatory. We've got to do it.
The greens, the air pollution, and
right.
everything.
We've got to do it.
So we have to do it. But there are prophecies, Ken, that indicate these things are coming down the pike, and it's the end of the age. What about that kind of thing?
All right. So let's look now and refocus ourselves a little bit and see if we can bring this thing down to maybe the climactic event of the thing. Now, we've talked in very general terms about the end of the age, and we've outlined those signs. Now let's look at what we might think would be the sort of the climactic event, and it seems that the prophecies are consistent to say that the nations, the armies of the nation, or an army of the nations gathering against the nation of Israel is that climactic event. Now, if we think about the population of Israel and population of the world, Israel is approximately 0.1% of world population. So how does 0.1% of 1% endanger or threaten 99.9%? And I think it's absurd.
But 5.5 million people living in a place that's
the size of some counties in Texas,
right?
Would threaten the whole rest of the world.
And yet it's in the paper every day.
Okay, so I think that tells us of the satanic nature of the thing.
All right.
I mean, that's absurd. So we want to look at a few scriptures now that specifically point to this. So John's going to read, maybe we'll start with Zechariah, and just to establish that the Bible is very specific of this climactic event.
Okay, so everything's always in the Bible, but especially Jerusalem. And it will come about that day that I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all the peoples, and all who lift it will be severely injured, and all of the nations of the earth will be gathered against it. So that speaks of a global government coming up against Israel at the end of days.
Absolutely. And that's not a singular reference. We could go to Joel. You're going to read one from Joel 3:2.
Yeah.
It says almost exactly the same thing.
Which is the basis for all these peace with Israel, is to give up these lands. And look what God said. I will gather all the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. Then I will enter into judgment with them there on behalf of my people and my inheritance Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations, and they have divided up my land. So here again, all the nations coming down, and God's going to judge them because they've divided up his land and scattered the Jewish people.
All right, and everybody knows, of course, that this ultimately leads to the so-called Battle of Armageddon, and the specific reference for that comes in the book of Revelation, chapter 16, and I asked John to read that also because I want to tie those things together.
Okay. All the kings of the whole world will be gathered together for war of that great day of God the Almighty. And in verse 16, and they gathered them together to the place which in Hebrew is called Armageddon. That's the valley of Megiddo, right by Solomon's fortress. This was written 2,000 years ago. The other prophecies were written about 2,500 years ago. And today, they seem to be becoming fulfilled in our day.
One of the things that is exciting, cause chill bumps run up down your arm, is to stand in the archaeological ruins of Megiddo and look over the plains of Jezreel and envision
and read Ezekiel 39
and read those scriptures,
right,
and envision the tank corps coming across there in that attack. And the Bible was again redundant and explicit about that situation. So we're talking about this climactic event.
And we're not, listen, this is just Bible, and you're Bible-believing Christians, and we need to be focusing on what's happening in our day right before us. How will all this stuff develop? Can you imagine that?
So I think the thought that prompted preparation for this program was seeing the events last week at the so-called Middle East Peace Conference in Annapolis, and just realizing some of the things that happened there. We see, for example, the demands of the Muslim world, and the demands of the Muslim nation will certainly are intended to destroy the state of Israel.
Oh, yeah. No, listen, if we think about what they're demanding that the borders be pre-67 back to the 1949 Armistice Agreement. They're demanding this, which is an invitation for war and an invitation for the annihilation of Israel.
And we have to recognize that what might have been possible for survival in 1947 and 48, 49, whatever, it would not be possible today, especially because of missile technology and the dimensions of weaponry.
If any of you out there have been to Israel and flew into Ben Gurion Airport, the Arabs could be right on the hills there shooting you down.
Right.
I mean, you wouldn't be safe to fly into the same airport. Not only that, there's a provision in there for all the Arab refugees to return. Now, first of all, the majority of them left before on their own. Israel didn't throw them out, but about 750,000 Muslims left Israel so the other Muslim nations could drive the Jews into the sea. But about 750,000 Jews left the Arab nations. So there's a switch in population. Of course, the Jews were all absorbed into the nation of Israel and are all citizens and productive for these last 50, 60 years, but the Arabs are still in camps, not absorbed by any of their brothers. A few were absorbed in Jordan, that's it.
So the Muslim nation is demanding
a biblical Israel be destroyed.
Yeah,
that's really
in other
what
words,
they're demanding.
Come
right down to it.
If you go back to pre-67 borders and that population,
and now
the
allow
demand
3
for
million
Jerusalem,
Arabs in demographically,
you destroyed Israel. Now, the alarming part of that to me personally is that the United States concurs with that.
Yeah, obviously, they're sponsoring the roadmap. And the roadmap is a formula for the destruction of Israel, not peace. Make no mistake about it. And we are the leader in the world pushing for the roadmap. So if we think about it in those terms, Ken is absolutely right. Our government's pushing for the destruction of Israel. And Israeli leaders are complicit in this. Somehow they think the United States is their savior, and they're bowing to the will of one administration after the other.
Yeah, I think we're seeing such manifestation of weak leadership, and it was particularly evident in the conference at Annapolis last week. I read in a number of Israeli papers, and it wasn't publicized here, but that the Muslim nation, the leaders of the Muslim nation, demanded that the Israelis enter through a separate entrance different from the ones that they did, because they didn't want to be seen associated with or defiled by the presence of the Israelis in that way.
And who organized this meeting?
And the protocols obviously was controlled by the United States, the State Department particularly. Gosh, if you and I did something like this, it would be called a hate crime.
All right. Yeah, absolutely.
We'd be arrested for doing what our government did in that regard. Now, the point we're getting at here is that the Israeli leadership was so blooming weak that they complied and smiled and went on about their business.
Okay, but the real hope, Ken, isn't in the current leadership of Israel. The real hope is in the young men of Israel growing up, believing in God, fearing God, knowing the history, knowing the prophets, and eventually they will see God and God alone is the source of their security and not the United States. It's in the group of these leaders that you've seen on this program, and thousands and hundreds of thousands just like them. They will not dishonor the name of God. God said in Ezekiel 36 that the Jewish people profane God's name amongst the nations, but these people will not profane God's name any longer. They're not going to put up with that kind of thing, Ken. And there's going to be a change in leadership, and it's coming.
So we're seeing a transition. And it's not a real rapid one, but we're seeing a transition in Israel. Now, if we go back to the early days of the modern state of Israel, the leaders did not or were not dependent upon the United States specifically. They acted more independently then than they do now. Somewhere around the first Gulf War, I think that was the first real sign of it. The Shamir government, even though they 39 missiles, I believe, that landed in Israel in that period, and Israel didn't respond, and that was a sign that we can understand that the Israeli leadership was they believe that they're dependent upon the United States. Now, John cited, and it's true, a new leadership is emerging in Israel. A whole new generation is coming forth in Israel, and they are convinced that God is their salvation, God is their protection, and not the United States. So sooner or later, they're going to come to a position of power, and when they do, they're going to solidify control of Judea, Samaria. They're going to cleanse and solidify control of Jerusalem and of the Temple Mount, and I believe that they'll get rid of the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and specifically build a temple or a synagogue, whatever. They'll establish the name of God. They won't profane the name of God anymore.
Right, and to response to that, we believe the Muslim nations will respond and demand that all the nations respond with them. And why would the nations want to respond with them? Well, there's oil. They want keep the oil going, and there's a 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, and besides that, they're buying interest. Our petrodollars, just last week, Ken, one of the Arab Emirates paid $7.5 billion to buy Citigroup, the controlling interest in the biggest banking conglomerate in this country. And so our petrodollars are coming back, and they're buying influence.
Okay,
and that's going to increase also.
Okay, so with oil coming up near $100 a barrel, we're transferring enormous petrodollars to the Muslim nation, and that money is coming right back in controlling banking and media. And so our warning, exhortation to you as a believer today is that you must be sure to establish independent sources of information. Programs like this one, you can do the same thing on the internet, looking at what's happening in the world. Don't rely on the major media sources, because they are going to be controlled by the Muslim nation. And so and our government, unfortunately, our government is doing likewise.
Yep.
Now we are convinced that real, godly, God-fearing Israeli leadership is in the process of emerging, and when they do, the media here is going to paint them as evil as they can be. The Sentinel, the local Sentinel.
And why would that be? Because they're people of faith, and the media always and the government always portrays people of faith as the enemy.
What do you think Hollywood will paint them as?
Oh yeah, and Hollywood, they're all lumped together with Muslim fundamentalist terrorists blowing up everything.
So you better make sure of your source of information, and so we invite you therefore to continue to tune here. Come and worship at fellowship, study at the Zamok Institute, make sure of your information sources. That's our program for tonight. Shalom.